everybody, and welcome back to the Jerry and Carol Harris Jewish Destiny series. I am your host, Rabbi Pinchas Landis, and it is so great to be back with you this week. And let's just dive right into our studies of Jewish history. So tonight we are covering a very interesting subject that I believe at some level most Jews are familiar with the general topics, but I would hazard to guess, because we know that every time I guess it is a hazard, that very few Jews have an understanding as to where this division within the Jewish world comes from. And of course I'm referring to the two general umbrella groups of the Jewish people, the Sefardim and the Ashkenazim, Sephardic Jewry and Ashkenazi Jewry. So why is it that when we look at the Jewish world, we know that we were given one Torah on Sinai, we have a oral transmission that is accurate, that was accurately passed down from generation to generation, yet we have these different groups that have such different customs. And the two major divisions within those groups are obviously the Ashkenazim and the Sefardim, the Ashkenazic Jewish community and the Sephardic Jewish community. So just to start right off with answering that question, we have to understand a little bit about the development of Jewish law. So within Jewish law, we have many different categories of law. We have things called deraises. We have laws that come from the Torah. We have laws called derabbanans, rabbinical laws. And within rabbinical laws, we have different divisions. We have laws that are considered halacha l'Moshe Sinai. We have laws that are learned out from our rabbis in the Talmud. But then after that, we have a whole separate division that is known as either minhagim or takanos, and either as customs or as established laws. And what those are, the Rambam explains this, is when a community decides to take something upon themselves, whether it's decreed by a court or a community unto themselves decides to take on a good custom, what we would call a hanhaga tova, that once the community takes that on, those customs are elevated to the status of rabbinic law. So, no, it is false that the prohibition of Ashkenazi Jewry of not eating kitnios on Pesach, that is not a rabbinic law that comes from Mount Sinai. That is a latter custom. We know it's a custom because it only was established as a custom after the split of the Ashkenazim and the Sefardim, because only the Ashkenazi community took on the custom not to eat legumes and kitnios on Pesach, whereas the Sephardi community did not. So therefore we know that's in this category as a custom. But once the Ashkenazi community takes that on, not to eat kitnios on Pesach, that is elevated to the status of rabbinic law. Now this can often be confusing, and there can be distinctions. We will still be more lenient with a law rooted in custom than a law rooted in the transmission from Sinai, yet they are still on the status of law. So therefore, when we are going to talk about our subject tonight of the split, or not even really the split, but the development of the Ashkenazi and the Sephardi communities going back 1,000 years, that in those past 1,000 years, the communities have indeed taken on different customs, and those customs, once they're taken on by the community, they become law. Right? We picked on the Ashkenazim a little bit with the kitnios. The Sephardim have the inverse of that, is that they say slichos for the full month preceding Rosh Hashanah. Whereas in Ashkenazi communities, we only do it from anywhere from about 4 to 10 days, depending on how the calendar falls. As I always say, it makes perfect sense that the Sefardim say slichos for a full 30 days before Rosh Hashanah, because you got to pay for it somewhere. You want to eat your kitnios on Pesach, you got to pay for it somewhere. Again, that is a custom in the Sephardic community that was elevated to the status of law once it's accepted as a custom. So while we're going to talk about these communities, and we're going to see a lot of different customs develop within the separate communities, that is how we can understand that these separate customs are not a contradiction to our concept, to our foundation of one Torah being handed down on Sinai from Moshe to the prophets all the way down to us, because most of the laws are from top down, so to speak, from God, Sinai, Moshe down to us, but customs are bottom up. So it's important to know that when we see a distinction, we have to look at it, and 99.999 times out of 100 we'll be able to say that those laws that are different from community to community, those are laws based in custom, bottom-up laws, and the ones that are top-down, say the Shema, keep the Shabbos, keep kosher, etc., those are going to be exactly the same despite the community. Okay. With that being said, when we left off last time, we had essentially, as we were discussing it, the entirety of the Jewish world was in Babylon. That was the center of the Jewish world. The head rabbinical leadership is the Gaon. We have the exilarch, the Reish Galusa. And that was the situation that the Jewish community finds itself in, essentially beginning with the destruction of the temple and on until roughly the year 1000. Now, again, after those first several hundred years, maybe 300 years after the destruction of the first temple, it takes a while for it to become clear that Israel is dwindling and going dark, and Babylon is lighting up. But we're going to see that Babylon is going to be the center until the year 1000. Now, what happens in roughly the year 1000, roughly we'll say the 10th century? What happens that makes it that Babylon is no longer the center? Because that's really what's going to lead to our separate, at least big umbrella communities of the Ashkenazi community and the Sephardi community. So let's start off in Babylon, and then we'll go to those other parts of the world. So in Babylon, there's basically two factors that lead to the other communities becoming more powerful. Factor number one is that even though the majority of the Jewish world is in Babylon, as we're going to discuss momentarily, there are still pockets that are becoming pretty sizable of the Jewish population that is not in Babylon. We're going to discuss the Jews in Spain and North Africa that are what we call the Sefardic Jews, the Jews in Germany and France, what we call the Ashkenazi Jews. And so, if you look at a map, it's pretty far to get from Babylon all the way over to Western Europe, to where the Sefardic and Ashkenazi communities are starting to develop. So as much as Babylon is supreme, in those days it could take as long as a year for a letter to get back and forth, to get one way to Babylon, and then another year to get back to Western Europe. So if your chief rabbi is the Gaon in Babylon, and you have a question about what to do in North Africa, and it's going to take you 2 years to get a response, well, it's eventually that starts to weigh on you. That starts to be a system that is not ripe for success. So that is one of the factors that we see that will start to take away from the supremacy of Babylon. Just the fact that there are Jews now in other parts of the world, and those communities have started to grow, and therefore they need internal leadership to really be able to thrive. Not only that, but we see within Babylon, we mentioned last time one of the greatest of the Gaonim, one of the greatest of the biblical leaders was Sefardic Gaon. But Sefardic, as we mentioned, had a number of fights during his lifetime. Now, there were fights l'shma, they were necessary to be fought. There were fights he had to win, the fights against the Karaites, the fight against Ben Meir, the fight against the Reish Galusa, etc. But even if a fight is justified, and it's l'shem shemayim, and it's a completely justified fight, it still takes its toll on the Jewish people. And we see this since time immemorial, that anytime there's a big fight within the Jewish people, even if it's legitimate, there is so much negative fallout from that fight. And that's one of the reasons why in Judaism we always say that shalom is prime. We talk about Aaron HaKohen, the great Aaron, the great Aaron in the Torah, and how one of his crowning jewels, his raison d'etre, was that he was an Ohev Shalom v'Rodev Shalom, Ohev es habrios u'mekarvim l'Torah. He loved peace, he ran after peace, he loved people, and he brought them close to the Torah. Because Shalom is supreme. Because we see that even when it's necessary to fight sometimes, there's never a happy ending after a fight. it always has a lot of negative fallout. And that's what happens after Rav Saadia Gaon and Babylon. That fight, because it was all over the Jewish world in many ways, it takes its toll, and therefore, so to speak, the shield of Babylon is nicked, the armor is nicked and beat up, and people don't look at Babylon with quite the same awe of supremacy, of leadership in the Jewish world as they did before, because a fight is never good. Okay, so that's sort of our backdrop that will lead to the Sephardic communities and the Ashkenazi communities starting to develop as separate communities. Now let's discuss geographically how such a thing happened. So I'm going to throw a map up here on the screen, and I have 4 different color arrows on this map. So if you look at first find Israel on the map right there, and you look at the red arrow shows the migration of Jews after the destruction of the first temple. So initially, about 90% of the exiles from the first temple head over to, we point to Baghdad, but this is a modern map, that is talking about Babylon. About 10% go to Egypt, and most of those will end up in Babylon also when Nebuchadnezzar takes over Egypt. But there is a tradition, especially on the part of the Barbanel, that there was also a small pocket of Jews at the time of the destruction of the first temple that made their way to Spain. The Barbanel, who is a great Spanish rabbi, writing on the origins of the Sefardic Jewish community, says that Nebuchadnezzar was an ally with the Spanish king, who at the time was named Pirush. And when Nebuchadnezzar took over all these Jews, and many of them were enslaved, and he was figuring out what to do with them, there were some of them that he sent over to his ally in Spain, to Pirush. And the Barbanel writes that there were those from the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, Shimon, and Levi that were sent by sea to Spain, and they settled in Lucena and in Toledo, and those Jews were there from the destruction of the first temple. They did not return to Israel for the Second Commonwealth, and therefore, according to the Barbanel, that was the beginning of the Sephardic Jewish community, and it dates back to the destruction of the first temple. That's what he writes. So if you look at that red area, and we take all these into consideration, or the red arrows, that was everywhere where the Jews went after the destruction of the first temple. Now, if you look at that purple arrow, that is the places that the Jews went for the most part after the destruction of the second temple. You see we have 2 arrows. One is heading again back towards Babylon, and the other one heads up towards Rome. Because as Josephus writes, after the destruction of the second temple, the slave markets across the world crashed because of all the Jewish slaves that Vespasian and Titus brought into the slave market, and many of those went through Rome. So while there are many Jews who were able to escape and flee towards Babylon and build the great Babylonian community that we've talked about the past number of weeks, there were upwards of hundreds of thousands that were taken into slavery in Rome and sold off throughout the world, and in many ways through the Western European world. So we're going to see that that they start off in Rome and they end up being sold to these other places, Spain, Germany, France, but eventually, because the slave market crashes, a Jewish community actually develops in and of itself in Italy after the destruction of the second temple. Okay, so that's where we go after the first temple. That's where we go after the second temple. You'll see here a green arrow that is Jews running from Christians. Because what happens is, we're going to see as the Christians start to take over in Rome and in Spain, the Jews are going to run. And that's how Jews are going to really get to other places in what we call Ashkenaz, which is basically Germany and France, or the places, or the area like the German Rhineland, where France and Germany meet. And that's how Jews also get to North Africa, because those Jews who are in Spain and those Jews who are in Italy are going to run from the Christians and end up in different parts of Spain, France, Germany, and North Africa. Now, I did also put in there a round 2 migration, because we know that after Jews went to certain places, they went further. We know that after Jews went to Babylon, they went to Istanbul / Constantinople / Byzantium, whatever it was called. We also know that once the Jews ran to Morocco, away from the Christians, they then went to Algeria and Tunis. And this is, at least geographically, how we see the spreading of the Jews. That yes, Babylon is still in many parts the center, but now we see that we have sizable communities in Spain, which we refer to as Sfard or Sephardic. The word Sfard is just the Hebrew word for Spain. And then Ashkenaz is really just the Hebrew word for Germany. So when we talk about Sefardic and Ashkenazi Jews at its base translation, we're really just talking about Spanish Jews and German Jews. Again, it's not exactly what it is, but that's really what it is. So our two main population centers outside of Babylon at this point are going to be Spain and really the border of Germany and France. The community is the border on Germany and France, and that's where we're going to find our Jewish communities. Okay, so I want to focus a little bit about how the Sephardic community develops into a community and then how the Ashkenazi community develops into a community. And both are really the stories that are told, the legends that are told, the histories that are told are very much tied to the cultures of each community. Okay, so what happens in the Sephardic world? So, as we said, Jews are there from the time of the first temple. And, we don't have a lot of indication as to what kind of life they lived. But one thing we know is that as the different barbarian groups take over the Roman Empire, that there is at least one such group that comes to Spain, a group by the name of the Viscos, and they take over Spain. And shortly after they take over Spain, they actually convert to Catholicism. And in the 7th century, King Sesbut of the Viscos is going to be the first of a long line of Sephardic kings that are going to give the option to the Jews of Spain to either convert or to be expelled or to be killed. And it's actually a very large amount of those Jews are going to convert outwardly, but remain Jewish internally. And a very large number are going to run. And they're going to run either towards France and Germany to become the Ashkenazi community, or they're going to run to Morocco, to North Africa, across the Straits of Gibraltar, and become more of the North African Sephardic community. Now, it's interesting. And this is a phenomenon that we see it now for the first time in the 7th century. It's going to become a little bit more infamous in the 14th century. But this concept of forced conversion on the Jews. And already here we see that this culture develops of there are those who will convert, but only do it externally while holding on to their Judaism internally. Now, in Jewish texts, we refer to those people as converso Jews. Converso is like a Spanish Ladino play on the word convert, and it means a Jew that converted to another religion. In Spanish, those Jews are going to be referred to as Marranos. Now, what does the word Marrano mean for anyone out there who's fluent in Spanish? The word Marrano in Spanish means pig, right? Because this is essentially what the Spanish Catholics think about the Jews who convert outwardly but not internally. It's a pejorative. It's not very nice. They call them pigs or swine. That's Marranos mean. So as a Jew, we should never refer to these people as Marranos. Not very nice. We call them conversos, or sometimes you hear crypto Jews. But those are the Jews that will outwardly convert to Catholicism. Internally, they will at least attempt to stay Jewish. Now, those who flee, like we said, they go to North Africa, they go to Morocco, and this is the beginning of the big Jewish community of North Africa, of Morocco, and then eventually to Algiers and Tunisia, and then meeting up again with whatever's left in Egypt from when the Jews were there from the destruction of the first temple. Okay, now, we're going to see that while this first round of Viscos are very difficult to deal with, there are going to be more benevolent Viscos kings, but the trend is set that we've discussed time and time again, that the Jews are going to always fare better under Muslim rule than under Christian rule. So North Africa, Morocco, these areas where the Jews are now are under the rule of the Moors. Now the Moors are a group of Muslims that Jews essentially always get along with because they're not so frum, right? They're not very fanatic in their belief in Islam, and therefore they usually work pretty nicely. With the Jews, we always deal very well with the Moors. Now, another group of Muslims that is also in this area in Spain and North Africa are the Berbers, who we have a much harder time with because they're much more radical. But the Moors are the ones who are in charge in Morocco, and therefore, as the Jews flee to Morocco, they have a certain amount of peace under the rule of the Moors. Now, at this time, or at least in the 8th century, 711 to be exact, there was a man who comes to North Africa and he opens up a convenience store, and because the year was 711, he calls it 711. I'm kidding, that never happened. But the year 711, there was a man by the name of, or a great leader, a great conqueror, by the name of Tariq ibn Sayyid. Now, it's important to point out, because we're going to have this time and time again amongst Jewish names. Ibn, like we have the Ibn Ezra, and we'll have a lot of Jews from Sephardic countries with that Ibn. Ibn is just Arabic for Ben. So if his name is Tariq ibn Sayyid, his name is Tariq ben Sayyid, Tariq the son of Sayyid. So anyhow, Tariq ibn Sayyid comes to, he embarks on a mission to go from Morocco, to go from North Africa, and to conquer Spain. Now, if you look back at the map we had before, any other map, you know that Morocco and Spain are just separated by the Straits of Gibraltar. Straits of Gibraltar, as we call it today, a little bit of water, and then you're in Spain. So as Tariq ibn Sayyid successfully crosses those what later become the Straits of Gibraltar and goes into Spain and starts a successful Muslim conquest of Spain, we have that area where he landed in Spain that is named for him. It's named Jabal Tariq, which means the mountain of Tariq. It eventually just becomes known as Gibraltar. So Jabal Tariq is Arabic for the mountain of Tariq, but Gibraltar is how we know it, and that's why that little country at the bottom tip of the Iberian Peninsula by the Straits of Gibraltar, just north of Africa, that is still controlled, believe it or not, I think it's the last vestige of the British Empire outside of Britain, known as Gibraltar, but that's named for Tariq, who conquers through that passage into Spain. And we're going to see that he has a lot of success as he goes to Spain. He pushes out the Viscas, he pushes out the Christians, and he pushes them all the way up to the north of Spain. Now, he's not going to get rid of them completely, but he is going to push them basically up to the north of Spain, and the Muslims will essentially be in control of the rest of the country of Spain from this point in the 8th century, essentially until the 13th century. And with the Muslims comes the general relationship between the Moors and the Jews, and the Jews are safe within Spain. The Muslims welcome the Jews welcome the Muslims and look at them as their saviors, and this begins what we call the Golden Age of Spain, because over the course of the next 4 or 5 centuries, the Jews are going to really thrive there, essentially unmolested, and reach tremendous heights of government. We're going to have a Jewish prime minister of Spain by the name of Shmuel HaNagid. We're going to have many great scholars come from this time period. Now, I want to make something clear. While this time period was indeed great, and we do call it the Golden Age of Spain, it does not hold a candle to the situation we have today in America. We are 100 times better off in America today than the Jews were of Spain, but compared to what the Jews had gone through the past several hundred centuries before this, and compared to what we'll discuss the Jews are going to go through in Ashkenazi countries, it was the Golden Age of Spain, and it was a time where the Jews truly thrive. Now, the different cities where we see there are large Jewish populations at this time are Cordoba, Granada, Toledo, Seville. Those become some of the big Jewish communities. And we see now that there is, we're going to see the Jews in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, now in Spain, and these places. And this is the bastion, if you will, of the Sephardic Jewish community. This is where the Sephardic Jewish community really starts to thrive and grow and become a community. Now, there is a time-tested fact that if a Jewish community is going to make it, it's not enough to have numbers. It's not enough to have Jewish institutions, synagogues, butcher shops, pizza shops, etc., that will never make a community. In fact, there's places like Cincinnati, where I used to live, where they would talk about in the early 1900s, it was the second largest Jewish community in the country, and there were, 50 kosher butcher shops, and it was just thriving. But, we all know, for those of us who know anything about the Jewish world, that Cincinnati did not exactly make it as a Jewish megatropolis. And that's the case in many communities. You would have large populations of Jews, but they just didn't make it as communities. And the reason is simple, that we know that the secret to Jewish survival is Torah, is the study of Torah, is the advancement of Torah study. And communities that embrace that fact, those are the ones who, so to speak, latch on to the miracle of Moshe, the miracle that Moshe told us, that if you stick with the Torah that he gave to us, we will survive throughout all time. And communities that don't, even if they have a lot of numbers and butcher shops and pizza shops and synagogues and whatever, they will not make it in the long term. And that's why Babylon becomes such a great community, because they build the great Babylonian yeshivas. And we're going to see now that the reason why we see our Sefardic and Ashkenazi communities really take their anchors is because they make this same commitment to Torah, where other parts of the Jewish world don't necessarily, and therefore don't survive. So there's, true to the culture of the Sephardic community until this very day, there is a almost poetic legend as to how Torah scholarship was brought to these communities of North Africa and Spain. And this is what we refer to as the legend of the four captives. We call it the legend because while it's written in a number of different sources, it's not so well anchored in historical sources, but at least this is the legend they tell, and either it's completely true, partially true, not exactly sure, but this is the legend of the four captives. That is how Torah scholarship comes to the Sephardi community. Now, what happens is this. As we mentioned, there's already a sizable Jewish community in Italy at this time. And because there's a sizable community, the community started to develop. It started to become a force to reckon with. And you have different institutions, different yeshivas in Italy, and the community, so to speak, starts to thrive. But don't think anything is new in the Jewish world. If you have a successful community in the Italian Jewish world, that still means that they are nonprofits, and that still means that they have to fundraise. So sure enough, as is the case unto this very day, the fundraising that will take place for the Italian institutions will not just take place in Italy, but it'll take place throughout the Jewish world. And there are four great scholars who go on a fundraising mission from Italy to North Africa, because like we said, this is the 10th century already. The North African community has started to thrive. This is already good 1.5, 2 centuries after Tariq ibn Sayyid has taken over and made it a Moorish area. And these rabbis go on a fundraising mission to try to raise some funds from there. So they leave from Bari, Italy, and they set sail, and they leave from Bari, Italy, which is where they disembark, and they set sail across the Mediterranean Sea until they come with their goal of going to North Africa. Now, there's only one problem. This was a time period when piracy was a big business. Now, I don't mean like stealing music and selling it on the internet, or stealing video games, or stealing movies, or whatever it is. That's modern day piracy. Piracy back in the good old days was real piracy, like Captain Hook and all that good stuff. And by the way, there's even legends that there were Jewish pirates at this time. But essentially, one of the main business of piracy, I mean, there are a lot of different aspects to it, but one of the main businesses was kidnapping people and ransoming them for money. And the pirates knew good and well that if they would capture Jews, that would be, a surefire way to a profit. And if they could capture prosperous Jews, then that would be a great payday. So the pirates, sure enough, had their spies, they had their intelligence missions, and they found out about these four rabbis going on this fundraising mission, leaving from Italy for North Africa, and they sure enough overtake the ship. They take the pirates as they take the rabbis as captives, and hence are named the four captives. Now, as the story is told to us, the rabbis' names are Rabbi Kusiel, Rabbi Moshe, Rabbi Shmaryahu, and we don't have the name of the fourth one. And what happens is they're captured by the pirates, and then the pirates go to try and sell the rabbis off to the highest bidders. And they are essentially, based on the legend, already close to North Africa at this point. So their emissaries go off to North Africa and start to try and ransom these rabbis off to the Jewish communities. Now, the Jewish communities in North Africa say, that's great. We'll ransom these rabbis, more than happy to. The big Torah scholars will pay your money, but we don't have Torah scholarship here in North Africa. And we can't keep writing back and forth to Babylon because it takes 2 years for us to get our letters back. We need our own scholars. So we will happily pay your ransom, but you have to stay in our communities, and you have to build in our communities, and you have to build Torah scholarship in our communities. So sure enough, that's what happens. Reb Kusiel settles in Kairouan in Tunisia, and Reb Moshe settles in Cordoba in Spain, and Reb Shmaryahu settles in Cairo, and the fourth one, like I said, we don't have his name or information. But this is the legend of the four captives and how it is told to us of how real, authentic Torah leadership comes to the Sefardic community. So now you have safety and protection from the Moors. You're going to have affluence, and now you have Torah scholarship as well. You have your whole recipe that you need to build a thriving Jewish community. And over the course of the next 500 years, or really 300 years, we're going to see the Sephardic community build into a truly powerful force and community to be reckoned with in the Jewish world. Now, at this time is really, as we see the Sephardic community start to develop, and we're going to see the Ashkenazi community develop a little bit later, probably another century later, this is basically means it's the end of Babylon. Now, that doesn't mean it's the end of the community. Babylon as a community will go on to exist until 1952, when the Jews will be kicked out of Iraq after the forming of the modern-day state of Israel. But as far as the supreme community, this is the end of it. So the Gaon, as the head of the Jewish world, the last one that we know of are Rav Shri Gaon and Rav Hai Gaon, and they're given the credit with being the end of the Gaonim, and they're also given the credits with starting a trend of codifying Jewish law, meaning we mentioned before the Talmud gives a certain amount of codifications of Jewish law, very loosely, but it's still very hard if you want to look up a halacha and know what to do as a code, and we see that Rav Hai Gaon is the first one to start to take steps towards that codification, which will be very much the focus of many of the rabbis that we call the Rishonim that we'll discuss in the coming sessions. Now, nobody, by the way, tells Babylon that they've lost their supremacy. So even after Rav Hai Gaon, we are going to have people who will take the title Gaon, who will think they're the center of the Jewish world, but they're not already. This is the end of that. We're now going to see there's a Babylonian community, there's a Sephardic community, and we'll talk in a moment about the Ashkenazi community. Now, one last thing about the Sephardim is that nowadays we sort of are, for lack of a better word, I'll call it our Jewish bigotry. We lump every dark-skinned Jew and call them Sephardi. Now, that's not true, because Sephardi, as we say, means that they come from Spain, and not every Jew with dark skin has their origins in Spain. I mean, I think one of the funniest examples of this is if you ever meet a Jew from Iraq, an Iraqi Jew will be lumped together as a Sephardi. But an Iraqi Jew is a Babylonian Jew, which means they, as we've said, predated all of this. So, and there's many other communities like that. The Yemenite community, for example, says to date back before the Sephardic community developed. The Persian community is very different than the Sephardic community. The more proper term, or slightly less offensive, I think, is Edat Mizrach, which means the Eastern community, because yes, it's true that a lot of these places, the Jews from the East, so to speak, have sort of been clumped together, and their customs have rubbed off on one another, and the customs are similar. So it's a little more politically correct to call them the Edat Mizrach, the Eastern community, or the Mizrahi community, another way of saying the Eastern community. But just so we know that many of them that we lump together and call Sephardic Jews are not in any way connected to Spain, to the Jewry of Spain. Another thing I'd like to point out, and this is an important point that I'll make time and time again, and it's a very important point that we shouldn't forget, is as we talk about the development of the Ashkenazi Jewry, one of the I guess, most obvious or famous distinctions between the Sephardic community and the Ashkenazi communities is the pronunciation of Hebrew. In fact, I was just on vacation in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, and the shul, or the Beit HaKnesset in Myrtle Beach, is a Sephardi shul. It's a Syrian Sephardi shul. And therefore, while many things are quite similar to the way that I daven every single day, the pronunciation is quite different. The Sephardic pronunciation is quite different than the Ashkenazi pronunciation. And, this is not only true in just certain letters being pronounced differently, but even in certain, and just the whole tone and the whole approach. Now, part of this is because we know that Ashkenazim are always in a rush. Like everything with Ashkenazim is always in a rush. For example, like at the Shabbos table, when we sit down to make hamotzi at an Ashkenazi home, we say, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam v'tzedechem in hearts, Amen, eat your challah, and we're good to go. But in a Sephardi home, they have like a whole way of making that hamotzi. Poteah et yadeha umazbia laho hayratzon. Misha Berach, right? They give the Chal Misha Berach, they go on, Anenu, Adonenu, Morenu, Al Benenu, Al Jazira, and they're just going on forever with their Hamotzi. And, that's, if you're ever, again, in a Sephardic community for the Torah reading, you know that they read the Torah in real time. The Ashkenazim just rush through it. Okay, so there's a lot of difference in the pronunciation, a lot of difference in the way the words are said. But, very important point to keep in mind, and that is, that there is nothing in Jewish etymology to say that the Sephardic or the Ashkenazic pronunciation is more accurate than its brother or sister. In other words, the Ashkenazim don't have anything to stand on to say their pronunciation is more accurate, and the Sefardim have nothing to stand on to say that their pronunciation is more accurate. Now, a lot of the, I'll call it stupid pressure we'll get nowadays is that some people honestly, stupidly think that, the proper pronunciation for Hebrew is the Sephardic pronunciation, because that is the pronunciation of modern Hebrew, of Ivrit, of the Hebrew spoken in Israel. And my friends, that couldn't be the furthest from the truth. Do you know why the Sephardi pronunciation is the pronunciation is used in the state of Israel today? Think about for a minute. Who founded the country? Was it the Sefardim? No. The Sefardim were considered second-class citizens until Menachem Begin comes to power in the 70s. In fact, I have a friend who's Sephardi, his father's from Israel, and he likes to say that when that he's Sephardi, and when he likes to say that when he grew up in Israel, he was black, and he came to America, and he became white. Because, unfortunately, that the Sephardim are treated as second-class citizens, and in many ways still are treated as second-class citizens in Israel today. So if that's the case, if the Ashkenazim is actually the WASPs, the white Ashkenazi socialist paratroopers that founded the state of Israel, and if that's the case, then why did they choose the Sephardic pronunciation? It makes no logical sense. The answer is because David Ben Gurion and Elazar ben Yehuda made a conscious decision that the language of the country would not be Yiddish, which would have made sense because that's what they all grew up speaking. And not only would it not be Yiddish, it would be Hebrew, but it would be Hebrew with a Sephardic pronunciation. To draw the line in the sand, to say that we have left everything of Eastern Europe behind. Now, that did not only mean the anti-Semitism and the hatred and the pogroms and all the terrible things of Eastern Europe, but they were also saying all the great things, the Torah, the scholarship, the Jewish culture. We're making the new Jew. And therefore, we are going to take the pronunciation of Hebrew that is the most different from us. Even though the people who speak that pronunciation, we're going to treat as second-class citizens, we're going to have Jim Crow laws for them, and it's going to be not so good for them in this country, but we're going to take their pronunciation because it makes us the new Jew, the most different and the furthest away from the Torah culture of Ashkenazi Jewry of Eastern Europe. So, that's why when an Israeli comes to me, when an Israeli comes to me and says, you don't speak Hebrew properly, I say, I'm sorry. You're speaking the Hebrew of Ben Yehuda and Ben Gurion. I'm speaking the Hebrew of the Vilna Gaon. I'll take the Vilna Gaon over them any day. Okay, so that's the development of the Sephardi community. Now, it makes sense that in the Sephardic community, we would have this almost legend about how the Sephardic community was developed. Because, one great thing about the Sephardim is they just love their rabbis. our rabbi, he is special. He knows the Torah, he knows the Gemara, he knows all the Sefardim, he knows everything, right? They always love the rabbis. It's a wonderful thing about the Sephardi community. Ashkenazi community is the complete opposite. Like, who is this schmuck they let in here? Why'd they let the rabbi in the board meeting? Rabbi gave a terrible sermon today, right? That's how Ashkenazim deal with it. So it makes sense that the Sefardim will have this glorified legend about how the rabbis got there. Okay, let's go now to the Ashkenazi community. So as we've discussed, the Ashkenazi community also develops around the same time for the same reasons. And geographically, we're talking essentially on that French-German border, what we call the Rhineland, the German Rhineland, the French-German Rhineland. And there is a concentration of Jews there. The community starts to grow. The situation is always going to be much different than it is in the Sephardic world because it's going to be under Christian rule, and therefore the Jews are never going to have it easy. They're never going to rise to the heights of their brethren just a little bit due southwest of them. But we're going to see that nonetheless, under really terrible circumstances, the Ashkenazi community is still going to thrive. Now, what's interesting is while in the Sefardic community we have this legend of the four captives, the beginning of true Ashkenazi scholarship is really homegrown. It comes out of the Jews that migrate there. The scholarship comes from within and is built up until we have the giants like Rashi and the Baalei Tosfos that we'll talk about next week. Now, the great rabbi who's considered the beginning of Ashkenazi Jewry is Rabbeinu Gershom Maor Hagola. Rabbeinu Gershom he's born in the end of the 10th century. And again, there's no dramatic story. He's homegrown. He was born in Metz, France, ends up moving to Mainz, which is one of the main communities. And he becomes a tremendous, tremendous scholar, builds a great yeshiva, and has a lot of scholarship coalesce around him, and becomes known as essentially the beginning of the Ashkenazi Jewry, because as the Sephardic community starts to develop and completely break away from Babylon, we're going to see from Rabbeinu Gershom on the same thing happens in the Ashkenazi community, that they have their own rabbis, they ask their own questions to their own rabbis, and therefore the community will start to coalesce around the rabbis. Now, Rabbeinu Gershom, besides being the first great Ashkenazi rabbi, he also is credited with making many of these, like we said, takanos, many of these laws that become Jewish law. And one of the ones that he is most famous for is he outlaws polygamy. So from this time, roughly the year 1000 on, we're going to see that polygamy, that marrying more than one wife, is prohibited within the Ashkenazi world. Now, by the Torah perspective, polygamy is technically allowed. Now, even when it's allowed, it is only supposed to be used in extenuating circumstances, and there's a lot of laws put on the situation that both women had to be treated equally, had to have separate homes, etc. And Rabbeinu Gershom felt that was not being done. He felt the system wasn't working, and therefore he outlaws polygamy, and from that point on, there's no polygamy in the Ashkenazi world. No sister wives, none of that stuff. Now, it will still exist in the Sephardi world until almost modern times. Maybe some places in the Sephardi world still does exist, but at least in the Ashkenazi world, that's going to be one of those different laws become custom, bottom-up laws, that we're going to see there's no more polygamy within the Jewish world. Now, hand in hand with that, Rabbeinu Gershom also makes it that you can't perform yibum anymore. Now, yibum is the marriage that takes place when a man dies without children, that his wife, before, so to speak, being free to marry whoever she wants, there's right of first refusal within his family, preferably his brother, not his brother's next of kin, and that brother, together with the wife, has a choice that if they will get married, that would be called yibum. If they do choose not to get married, they have to do something called chalitza, the unchewing ceremony. Because polygamy is now illegal, according to Rabbeinu Gershom, well, a lot of times when you'd have situations of yibum, it would end up in polygamy, because if the brother next to kin was already married, well, he would want to, build up his brother's name. He'd want to perform yibum, so he'd take on two wives. So Rabbeinu Gershom also says no more yibum, because first of all, that it could lead to polygamy. Second of all, he also felt it wasn't being done for the right reasons. From this point on, anytime you have a situation of a husband passing away without children, it goes straight to chalitza, the unchewing ceremony, and we do not do yibum anymore. two other famous laws of Rabbeinu Gershom is a decree that you cannot read other people's mail. Until this time in the ancient world, there was no privacy, but in the Jewish world, they would seal their mail with Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom, and that was a way of saying that I guarantee this is not being read by others. By the way, the same prohibition goes for emails, text messages, whatever, and it's really the beginning of privacy laws in the Jewish world. And another thing is, like we mentioned before, you're going to have this concept come up time and time again of Jews converting under duress outside of Judaism, and Rabbeinu Gershom within the Ashkenazi world, and we'll see also the Rambam in the Sephardic world, is going to make it that those Jews should always be welcomed back into the Jewish community without question and without fault, because no one should ever have to be subject to the pressures that they are subject to, and therefore those are some of the famous laws that Rabbeinu Gershom enacts for us. Okay, we're just about out of time. Next week we will introduce the Crusades, which will be a very negative backdrop, mainly in the Ashkenazi world, but also we'll see partially in the Sephardi world at this time. And we'll also start to delve into great giants of this time period, like Rashi, the Balei Tosos, and the Rambam. And I look forward to having you join us. For those of you who are tuning in from Cleveland or who want to come to Cleveland next week, next Thursday night is the engagement party, the Vart for my daughter and soon-to-be son-in-law, Ayala and Dovi, 6 to 8 p.m. at Green Road Synagogue. I hope you'll join us. If you're here in Cleveland, if you want to come to Cleveland, we'd love to have you. And for those of you who are from somewhere else, just say the date. The chasana, the wedding, God willing, will be Lag BaOmer in Yerushalayim. Everyone have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much, and I look forward to being with you next week.